All right, good morning. I think everyone is on. We're going to go ahead and get started. If we have some late arrivals, they'll still be able to log on. But good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the Office of Highway Safety and Justice Programs FFY 2023 Highway Safety Grant Solicitation Workshop, otherwise known as our Funding Guidelines Workshop. I want to thank you all for taking the time this morning to learn more about our Highway Safety Grant Program and for participating in this workshop. So my name is Jasmine Simmons. I am the Highway Safety Planning and Evaluation Coordinator for our office. I work on the programmatic side. Today, I will be delivering the programmatic portions of today's workshop. Today, you will also be hearing from Raphael Hellebuck, who is a statistician, and he is the Fatality Analysis Reporting System Supervisor with our office's Statistical Analysis and Research section. He will be delivering a brief presentation on some of our state's traffic collision statistics. And then finally, the financial section of today's workshop is going to be presented by Holly Eny. She is a grants administration accountant with our highway safety accounting team. All right, so again, today's agenda, I'm just going to go through an overview. I've already introduced those folks who are speaking today. Again, we're going to have a brief presentation on those collision statistics. I will be delivering the programmatic portion. Holly will be delivering the financial section, and then we're going to wrap up with some tips on how to write a successful grant application. So just some general housekeeping items before we get started today. Please go ahead, if you have not already, and mute your microphone. That way we don't have any background noise or feedback during the workshop. If you are calling in via your cell phone or a desk phone, if you could mute, pick the mute option for us again so we don't pick up any background noise or feedback during the workshop. I also ask that you should see a chat feature. Those of you who are on the computer, a chat feature, please type in your name and your agency. We're going to use that as a signing in for today's workshop. You'll have until the end of the workshop to do so, but I will, remind you throughout. But yes, please go ahead and type your name and your agency in that chat feature. Also, just a note, so we've included some designated breaks in the workshop for you to ask questions. However, you can also type your questions into the chat feature. This chat will be monitored by someone in our office. They will either answer your question via the chat if it's something they can just give a quick answer to, or during that question break, that person will read that question aloud so that way we can provide a verbal answer. If you would like to verbally ask a question during one of those designated question breaks, there should be a raise hand feature option via WebEx. So you want to click that raise hand feature, and then the person who is monitoring the chat will basically call on you, and then you'll be able to ask that question. All right, so just an overview of our Highway Safety Grant Program staff contacts. All of these folks, including myself, this is our contact information. This is also located on our website. So if we move from this slide and you haven't been able to write anything down, don't worry. Again, this information is available on our website. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get Raphael to jump on. Again, he's going to deliver just a brief presentation on some of our state's traffic collision statistics.
Hey everyone, this is Raphael Hellebuck. I'm one of the statisticians here at SCDPS. I'm assuming y'all can hear me. If y'all can't, just put in a message saying we don't hear you. But yeah, I'm just going to briefly present some of the statewide data for 2016 to 2020. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just go over a couple of the caveats within it. And if you want like a hard version of this, we can always email you a link. So after the workshop. So, if this type of stuff interests you, feel free to reach out to Jasmine. But anywho, so like I said, a lot of these tables are kind of explain themselves, but just to go over some of the important things. So we have here the most recent 5 years of data that grant applications usually mess with when they're filling their information out. Here we have the statewide traffic collisions by year, and it's broken down into the types of collisions, the types of people killed, and those injured. Keep in mind that there's a couple of criteria for something to be considered a collision. Little things like there has to be at least $1,000 worth of property damage and or a fatality involved. And of course, it has to involve at least one motor vehicle. So if like a pedestrian and a bicycle run into each other, that's reported to the police, that won't count. So as we can see here, 2019, some of the key features, we have fatalities. From 2018 to 2019, they were starting to go down, but then it jumped quite a bit for 2020. And that's a very interesting feature because, during 2020 is when the pandemic started. So you would think that people who stayed at home more would cause less fatalities, but that wasn't the case. But anywho, for here we have the death rate. So you can see for 2019 is we have 58 billion miles traveled, and for 2020 we can see that the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, decreased quite a bit. However, once again, the fatalities went up as well. Also keep in note that this is the death rate for every 100 million miles. So that's where these death rates are calculated from. The next table, we have the clock timing. It's just an interesting figure regarding some of the rates for the most recent year. So we have one collision every 4.3 minutes, one fatality every 8.2 hours, one non-fatal injury per 11 minutes, and a property damage collision every 6 minutes. The last table on this page, we just have some DMV and Department of Transportation information regarding registration and licensed people on the roadway. And this just continues on. So the next tables, a lot of grants inquiries that come to us regard things that have to do with speed-related collisions because of people driving a little recklessly on the road. Our data is compiled by the TR310s that the officers fill out, and these speed-related traffic collisions are based on how the officer reports their collisions based on contributing factor. So when it says speed-related, that means that somewhere on the report, the officer put something along the lines of one of the drivers was, exceeding the speed limit, reckless driving, things like that. And once again, it's just rinse repeat of the breakdown of how these numbers are compiled. We also have pedestrians. Keep in mind, as I said before, this has to involve at least one other motor vehicle. So if two people run into each other on the sidewalk, it doesn't count. And yeah, we can just see 2020, there was a decrease in total pedestrian involved collisions. Just like pedestrians, we have pedocyclists or bicycles, as we all know. Once again, same breakdown in terms of types of collisions and the breakdown of people hurt or killed. And here we have contributing factors for collisions. So for 2020, these are the most frequently reported contributing factors on those reports. So for fatal collisions, DUI was the most prevalent. And for other non-fatal collisions, we can see that driving too fast is the most frequent cause for collisions in general. The next table, we have top counties. So you're going to see a very similar pattern. This is the pattern that's been going on for as long as I've been working here, where Greenville, Horry, Charleston, Spartanburg, and Richland usually take the top spots for all types of collisions. I mean, that makes sense because those are the most populated areas. You know, Greenville's growing at a rate no one expected, so more people will just get into accidents. People at the beach, Horry County, and Charleston, same deal. And so yeah, it's not rare to see these 5 counties in the top list of anything collision related. And this is just a more detailed description of the county breakdowns. Greenville takes the top spot. The ones in red are kind of like the hot counties, and the black ones not so much. So once again, at the top, you can see Greenville, Charleston, Horry, Spartanburg, and Richland. And this table here is for fatal and severe collisions. This is just a continuation of it, and just more tables for the counties. One thing I will mention here is that this last column is just the sum. It's nothing fancy. It's just 16 up to 20. So that's why these numbers are so much bigger on the right column. These are DUI breakdowns. We can see that Lexington kind of sneaked its way in here, but for the most part, the pattern is the same. So I know a lot of grants have to do with DUI or wanting DUI information, so you know we can always provide things like that. So when it comes to specific things that y'all might want, and perhaps they're not on these tables that I'm showing y'all, you can always ask and be like, hey, can you provide so-and-so data? Can y'all do that? And we can just let you know yes or no if that's doable. So, you know, feel free once again to reach out. And this is, instead of DUI, speed related. And pedestrian breakdowns. Here I forgot to highlight the top ones in red, but same deal. So I'm just gonna leave that on for a couple more seconds and I'll go to the next one. Okay. And we have a petacyclist breakdown for the counties as well. And moped involved. Moped has been increasing in popularity recently. More people are using mopeds to drive around, especially now that you know, they require licenses, I believe, to operate nowadays. So because of that, we can keep better track of what's going on with mopeds, and as a result, there's been an increase in moped requests. So once again, that's also something we could do. Motorcycle involved, just like mopeds, a lot of people during the pandemic bought motorcycles, which caused a lot of problems in terms of collisions for 2020. That's another topic for another day. So, and that's it. You know, once again, keep in mind there's different types, you know, not just motorcycles, mopeds, bicycles, you know, there's also train involved, something as obscure as horse carriage involved collisions. So, you know, if there's something that wasn't on these documents, you know, just email me. I think I'll provide Jasmine with either me or my manager's email, and you can always reach out to us and get an answer. And so I think from here, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm gonna give it back to Jasmine. And if I scroll too fast, I'm sorry, but yeah, like I said, she'll email you the document so you have more time to digest all these numbers. All right. Anyway, hope you all have a good rest of the day, and I think I'm done. So. And I'm sorry, just one more thing I want to add. That keep in mind this is statewide data. We can also break this down by like specific counties or jurisdictions, not towns. Just specific counties and jurisdictions that if you're in a certain part of South Carolina, yeah. So that's it.
All right, again, so thanks so much to Raphael for that presentation. We will be providing the document that he presented at the end of the workshop. We should get that by close of business today. If you do have a specific statistical requests that you'll need for your applications, you can always email them to Raphael or his supervisor, Ross. That information, their contacts, their phone number, and their emails are available on our website. But I can also include that information in the post-workshop email. All right, so we're going to begin with the grant funding cycle for FFY 2023. So this screen is just some important dates to keep in mind. So on December 30th of 2021, the funding guidelines document was made available on our website. That'll be a great tool for you guys when you are completing your application. So again, that PDF, the funding guidelines for FFY 2023 Highway Safety Grant Projects, is available on the OHSJP website. So again, January 19th, 2022, today we are holding our grant solicitation workshop. February 11th, 2022 is the deadline for new user registration for SCDPS grants. SCDPS grants is our online grants management website. So in order to apply for one of our highway safety grants, you will have to have a user account and on SCDPS grants and create the application that way. We'll go into more detail later, but February 11th, for those folks who do not have a user name or user account on SCDPS grants, February 11th is the last day to create that account. And most importantly, February 25th, 2022, that is the application deadline for these highway safety grant applications. Those applications will be accepted on SCDPS grants until 11:59 p.m. That is a hard deadline, no exceptions. So if you're having difficulty that day submitting, we're going to be here in the office until 5 p.m. on February 25th. So please don't hesitate to call or reach out to us. And then we'll also, by the end of close of business today, you'll receive some information about how to register and just an instructional guide on the SCDPS grants, and that'll have like a technical support phone number. So you want to reach out to those folks too. So again, these are just some important dates to keep in mind. Also, for maybe some folks who joined in a little bit later after I began, please make sure that your microphone is muted. I'm getting a little bit of feedback from somebody. All right, so the FFY 2023 grant funding cycle. This is the general timeline. So again, the applications are due February 25th by 11:59 p.m. So during the months of March and April, that will be our office's grant application review. In May, the Public Safety Coordinating Council will hold a meeting where they also will review those grant applications. July is when we submit, our office submits our highway safety plan for the federal fiscal year 2023 to NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I'll go into detail on them in one slide, but we submit that plan to NHTSA. In August, we will prepare those grant award packages. In September, those folks who are approved will receive notifications of awards. Those who are denied will also receive information or notifications about that decision. And then October, the grant year starts October 1, 2022. So in October, we will hold those project management conferences for those folks who have been approved for grant application. All right, so the purpose of highway safety funding. I realized in sending out and contacting agencies that there may be some folks who are participating in the workshop today who aren't familiar with the highway safety side of the Office of Highway Safety and Justice Programs. So the OHSJP is a pass-through agency for those funds from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is a part of the Federal Department of Transportation. So again, we are the pass-through agency, and we disseminate those funds to folks who apply for those highway safety grant funds. So The purpose of the highway safety funding is to, it's intended to provide support for the following. So the development of new highway safety activities in the identified priority emphasis areas and or the expansion of established highway safety activities in the identified priority emphasis areas. All right, so this is our first question break. So any questions about the funding cycle and the timeline, the statistical information, anything like that before we dive into the programmatic portion of the workshop? And if you have a question, let's see, you can use that raise hand feature. You can type it into the chat. That way we can see it. See, can we get the name of who is speaking? So my name is Jasmine Simmons. I'm the Highway Safety Planning and Evaluation Coordinator for the office. You're welcome. And earlier, I'm not sure, it looks like Betty Ann Davidson asked that question. Raphael Hellebuck was who was delivering the statistical information. So he's who you can reach out to if you have those data requests. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions, so we're going to go ahead and continue. Okay, so the 3 priority emphasis areas that are eligible for funding in FFY 2023 are going to be impaired driving countermeasures, police traffic services, and occupant protection. So we will dive into all 3 of those areas, and we're going to begin with the impaired driving countermeasures. Okay, so priority emphasis area, impaired driving countermeasures, we actually break that down into alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects. So I know there are some folks, this may be your first time hearing this information, and then we also have some folks who've had a grant with us or who have applied in the past. But a big thing that'll be new for FFY 2023 that starts in October 1 of this year is that law enforcement agencies may apply for activity hour-based or straight time alcohol impaired driving enforcement grant projects and or overtime hour-based alcohol impaired driving enforcement grants. So this is the first time we're offering those overtime hour-based enforcement grants. I know that folks are probably going to have a lot of questions about that. Please go ahead and type those questions into the chat. And then when we have that designated break section, you can also raise your hand, use the raise hand feature and ask those questions. We will, as I said earlier, have a financial portion. So it may be that your question is more geared towards a financial portion and that question will be answered during the financial section. But please go ahead and enter those questions in the chat. So again, agencies can apply for either activity hour-based straight time enforcement projects under the alcohol impaired driving category and or overtime hour-based enforcement grants underneath impaired driving countermeasures. So if you want to apply for an alcohol impaired driving enforcement project, your grant application or your grant proposal must report a high incidence of alcohol-related crashes or a significant increase over the previous year. So that's when you will include that statistical data that proves the high incidence of those alcohol-related crashes, or if you've seen an increase from last year to this year. You must also provide crash data to support or demonstrate that your jurisdiction, your area, has an alcohol-impaired driving problem. You'll also want to include an alcohol-impaired driving enforcement plan that will describe the efforts that your agency will do or that will start to increase those alcohol-related arrests and also to reduce those alcohol-related collisions, injuries, and fatalities. So 2 of these bullet points, the first 2 are really based upon making sure that you have that statistical data in your grant application. So if you've got data, I know some folks have data already, but if there's something that you need, Raphael mentioned, you know, you can reach out to them If you need the data from from 2016 to 2020, 2016 to 2021 for your jurisdiction for alcohol-related crashes or injuries or fatalities, you can write it that way and submit that statistical request via email to our team. So this is important to note for those folks who are applying or will be applying for an alcohol impaired driving enforcement project. So those personnel who are outlined to perform the grant activities, they should be highly trained and skilled to detect alcohol impaired driving, and they must work primarily night and weekend shifts between the hours of 3 p.m. and 6 a.m. So those personnel who will be performing those grant activities, if you apply for a straight time grant or an overtime grant, they still must work primarily night and weekend shifts between 3 p.m. and 6 a.m. And I do want to back up a little bit. We're going to cover this, I believe, during the financial portion, but we don't fund personnel. We actually fund activity hours. That's why in the previous slide, it made note to distinguish between activity hour based / straight time grants and then overtime hourly based. So we do not fund personnel. We fund activity hours, or in this case for the upcoming year, overtime hours. All right, so as I just explained, we don't fund personnel, we fund activity hours. So those activities are eligible for reimbursement under these alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects. So for the activity hour-based projects, the eligible activities are dedicated impaired driving enforcement, conducting in checkpoints, conducting saturation patrols, participating in alien law enforcement network sponsored and or multi-jurisdictional checkpoints, court time, allowable and OHSJP approved trainings, also attending law enforcement network meetings, and then conducting impaired driving related safety presentations. So those activities are eligible for reimbursement underneath the activity hour-based projects. For the overtime-based projects, the eligible activities are dedicated impaired driving enforcement, conducting saturation patrols, conducting checkpoints, and then participating in law enforcement network sponsored and or multi-jurisdictional checkpoints. So as you can see, there's a difference between the two hourly based projects. Just another important note for those activity hour based projects, you can assign up to 4 officers to to perform those eligible activities. For overtime-based projects, an unlimited number of officers may be assigned to perform those eligible project activities. All right, and finally, a final note underneath alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects. So a law enforcement agency does not have to have an overtime policy in place to apply. So if you do not have an overtime policy as of February 25th, 2022, the application deadline, you can still apply for an overtime hour-based grant. However, if you are approved for that grant, you must have an overtime policy already in place upon grant award acceptance. So don't be discouraged if your agency currently does not have that overtime policy. You'll just need to have a policy in place. Again, we will notify you if you're approved, if your application has been approved sometime in September. Once you receive that notification, you must have that overtime policy in place to accept the grant award. Another note, a law enforcement agency can submit an application for both types of projects, overtime, alcohol impaired driving enforcement grant projects, and the activity hour / straight time alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects. However, those officers that will be performing the activities. They cannot be assigned to perform, let's say you get approved for both, an officer cannot be assigned to perform hours on both an overtime grant and an activity hour-based grant. And we will go into more detail on that in the financial portion. So that's going to conclude the alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects that are underneath the priority emphasis area of impaired driving countermeasures. Next, we have the special DUI prosecutor projects. I know some of you are familiar with these projects and some of you are not. So these projects, the goal is to increase the conviction rate of DUI offenders in those priority counties where there is a backlog of DUI cases and also a problem of effectively prosecuting DUI jury trials. So if you would like to apply for a special DUI prosecutor project, your grant proposal, your grant application must demonstrate that the targeted county or counties has a substantial backlog of DUI cases, including the age of those cases. So you would need to get that data from your county or your counties on your, the number of backlog cases, and then the average age or the age of the oldest case, etc. You're going to want to provide the conviction rate for the previous 3 years, so that can be calendar years, in the county or counties or judicial circuit. You want to provide the number of cases that have been dismissed over the past 3 years. Again, can be calendar years. And you want to provide project evaluation and implementation plans for that special DUI prosecutor. So the special DUI prosecutors, they are not eligible for overtime hours. Those grants are activity hours. So next area or next type of project that's eligible underneath the priority emphasis area of impaired driving countermeasures is this traffic safety resource prosecutor project. So that project, the goal is to provide critical support to enhance the capability of South Carolina's prosecutors and law enforcement officers to effectively prosecute traffic safety violations. So when you apply for this particular project, which we currently have, but when you apply for this particular project, your proposal must include a plan to accomplish the following activities. You want to assess the training needs of the state and develop and provide training programs for those prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and other traffic safety professionals, with an emphasis on the effective prosecution of those impaired driving cases. Your proposal should include a plan that provides technical assistance and legal research to prosecutors on a wide variety of legal issues, including standardized field sobriety testing, implied consent, accusatory instruments, etc. And then also that traffic safety resource prosecutor will serve as a resource to prosecutors in the state on impaired driving and other traffic safety cases. So new for federal fiscal year 2023 is the State Judicial Outreach Liaison Project. So for this project, the goal is to provide critical support to improve the delivery of justice and impaired driving through education, communication, community outreach activities, and collegial and ethical collaboration with judges, traffic safety entities, and stakeholders. So those of you who are going to apply for these, called the SJOL, your proposal must include a plan to accomplish the following activities. I'm not going to read all of them, but you want to have, the plan must include a thorough understanding of the national and state judicial education programs available currently on impaired driving. You want to contact and establish a working relationship with local judges and judicial educators to promote judicial education. You want to also identify barriers that hamper effective training currently, education and or outreach to the courts, and recommend alternative means to address those issues and concerns. And then also you will share information as appropriate with our law enforcement liaisons, with the Office of Highway Safety and Justice Programs, with NHTSA, with the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor, and then other stakeholders about opportunities to improve the criminal justice system. So that's going to conclude the priority emphasis area impaired driving countermeasures. I'm not going to take a break right now for questions. I have a question break coming up after I get through the last two priority emphasis areas. So I'm going to move on into police traffic services. So underneath the priority emphasis area of police traffic services, we have police traffic services enforcement projects. Similar to the impaired driving, the alcohol impaired driving enforcement projects, those folks who are applying for police traffic services enforcement projects can also apply for a straight time activity grant or hourly activity grant and or an overtime hour based PTS enforcement grant. So for the PTS grants, which are focused on the speed-related collisions, injuries, and fatalities, your grant application proposal must report a high incidence of crashes or a significant increase over the previous year. For those crashes, they need to be related to speed-related injuries, crashes, and fatalities. You'll want to provide the crash data to support or demonstrate the highway safety problem in your area related to those driving too fast for conditions or speed-related issues. You'll also want to develop an enforcement plan to address the issue of speed. However, for those PTS projects, your enforcement efforts should also include an emphasis on impaired driving enforcement, occupant protection, which is seatbelt use and child passenger safety laws, and also other hazardous driving issues. So any driving issue that's in your jurisdiction that will, via the grant project, will impact collisions, injuries, and fatalities. All right, so we have a breakdown just as we did for the alcohol impaired driving enforcement project. So for those police traffic services enforcement projects, for the activity hour-based projects, the following activities are eligible for reimbursement. So it's going to be dedicated traffic enforcement, conducting checkpoints, conducting saturation patrols, participating in the alien-sponsored and or multi-jurisdictional checkpoints, court time, the allowable and Office of Highway Safety and Justice approved trainings, attending those law enforcement network meetings, and then conducting highway safety related educational presentations. For the overtime-based projects, the eligible activities for reimbursement are dedicated traffic enforcement, conducting checkpoints, conducting saturation patrols, and again, participating in law enforcement network sponsored and or multi-jurisdictional checkpoints. So for these projects, the same note as I said for impaired driving enforcement projects, up to 4 officers can be assigned to perform the eligible activities for the activity hour-based projects. And then for overtime-based projects, an unlimited number of officers may be assigned to perform those eligible project activities. Okay, and then also for PTS projects, same thing as with the impaired driving enforcement projects. Don't have to have that overtime policy in place to apply. However, you must have that overtime policy upon grant award acceptance. You can apply for both an overtime PTS enforcement project and an activity hour-based project. You could apply for PTS, the 2 for PTS and the 2 for impaired driving as well. And then again, if you apply for both an overtime PTS enforcement grant project and an activity hour-based PTS enforcement grant project, an officer cannot perform hours on both types if you're approved. All right, so moving on to our final priority emphasis area, which is occupant protection. So this would be a community safety belt project and or a project focused on minority groups and rural populations and youth and safety belt usage. If you want to apply for an occupant protection grant, you would want to ensure that your proposal has, you want to demonstrate a need exists to implement these community projects that include minority groups, rural populations, and young drivers. Your proposal must provide innovative and creative approaches to encourage and promote the proper use of occupant restraints and to increase those usage rates. Your grant project should be educational and designed to measurably increase the usage of safety belts among teenagers and young males where belt usage has been traditionally low. And finally, if you have like a youth-focused project, you want to focus on entire school districts, involve students, teachers, and administrators, and should be tied into all school activities. Okay, and with that being said, that is that completes the details about our priority emphasis areas. Just an overview of the items eligible for highway safety grant funding. This will kind of be a recap of some of the things we discussed earlier. So items eligible would be an implementation of educational efforts to increase public compliance with occupant protection laws, implementation of a comprehensive enforcement program for detecting, arresting, and convicting impaired drivers, the development and administration of countermeasures programs to correct those identified highway safety problem areas, and program coordination for impaired driving prevention, public information, and educational activities. All right, so continuing with the overview of items eligible for highway safety funding. So necessary mission-related equipment, training and associated travel costs are only eligible for reimbursement with straight time / activity hour based projects, just to note. The evaluation of the effectiveness of highway-related programs or project improvement. Just another note on training. So the cost of training is allowable using curricula developed by, equivalent to, or endorsed by the United States Department of Transportation and NHTSA. Again, another note, those training costs are only eligible for reimbursement with those activity hours or straight time hour grant-based projects. And then finally, the purchase of child restraints in compliance with NHTSA performance standard. That's the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard number 213. And then development costs of a new training curricula and materials are allowable if they will not duplicate materials that are already developed for similar purposes by the DOT or NHTSA or by other states. However, this does not preclude modifications of present materials necessary to meet particular state and local instructional needs. So the general funding requirements. So all submitted proposals, so that includes occupant protection, impaired driving, police traffic services, all submitted proposals should demonstrate a significant highway safety problem and or need, a measurable impact on highway and traffic safety, including a data-driven approach with measurable goals and objectives. It should also demonstrate cost effectiveness, a comprehensive approach in a well-defined geographical area, a method for project evaluation, and budgeted items which are justified in an integral part of approved highway safety program. Those general grant project requirements. So whether you apply for an occupant protection, police traffic services, or an impaired driving countermeasures grant, there are programmatic reporting requirements that can include either a monthly enforcement data report for those enforcement projects or a monthly log for this, like special DUI prosecutor projects, etc. All of those projects, you will have to complete a programmatic quarterly progress report and also a cumulative final narrative report. Some additional programmatic requirements will include an active participation in the local law enforcement network, and then also participation in special enforcement awareness campaigns initiatives, including but not limited to Sober Slammer and Buckle Up South Carolina. So for those programmatic reporting requirements that I just read, you'll also need to include supporting and verifying documentation to submit with those reports. And then the participation in those special enforcement awareness campaigns that I read, those are only for the enforcement grant projects. All right, so some things to keep in mind. So you want to review the grant rules and timelines before drafting your application. Also, just a note, it's on the screen. When you draft your application, I also suggest not just putting it into SCDPS grants, but also drafting it in a separate Word document. That way you have a backup copy. Applicants are encouraged to take advantage of technical assistance. So reaching out to myself, any of the other program coordinators for technical assistance when you are drafting your application. You'll want to write your problem statement and narrative first and then build your budget. And also, this is important to note that some grant application dollar amounts are reduced during the review process. I do also want to add that we do have sample grants online for the activity hour grant. So for police traffic services, impaired driving, and special DUI prosecutor, a special DUI prosecutor that's housed in a law enforcement agency, and then one that's also housed in a solicitor's office. So we have those sample grants. We will notify you when the overtime sample grants become available on our website. All right, so any questions about any of the programmatic information I just reviewed? We're going to begin the financial section in a second. Any questions about any of the information that I just reviewed? And again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature, or you can put it in the chat. All right, doesn't look like we have any questions just yet. That's okay. Like I said, we're about to begin the financial portion, and I'm sure some folks will have questions as Holly goes through that section. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Holly so she can provide information on the financial portion.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Holly. It's nice to see you all this morning. Hope you're staying warm in this very cold weather. I am going to be presenting to you today the financial portion of this presentation. So if you could just bear with me to kind of get this started. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay. So we're gonna start off with claims. And one more thing before I begin, I apologize. If you could please just save your questions until the end, I would very much appreciate it. I know many of you probably do have plenty of questions because there are some changes this year. If you could, like I said, just share with us at the end so we can get to you all. It would be great if you use the chat box. We definitely want to make sure we get to each and every question you may have. Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to start with claims. Requests for reimbursement are submitted to OHSJP on a RFP form. RFP forms must be submitted at least once a quarter. You can submit it more than that if you would like to, just in the very least once a quarter. Also, if you did not have any activity for the quarter, we ask that you fill out a $0 RFP and turn that into us. Again, that's only if you're not claiming anything, you didn't have any activity. Just fill out that $0 form and we'll take care of that for you. Failure to submit claims as required may result in the deobligation of the project. That is very important. OHSJP highway safety grants are governed by the 2 CAFR 200, the Super Circular. We will cover many of these topics today outlined in federal regulations. Claims may be held if the grant recipient is delinquent in the submission of required reports or completion of other necessary actions. If you guys are running late in your reports, short shaft, we're very reasonable with these things. Just reach out to us, communicate with us. We want to work with you guys and support you in any way that we can. So just shoot, whoever is handling your grant, myself, Talima, just shoot us an email and we will definitely work on getting you guys taken care of. So this is an example of the first page of our RFP form. This is the PT form. If you have a PT grant, you can see you list your subgrantee name, your address, project title, payment type, and grant number. Make sure that your payment type is correct. With our final RFP, you want to make sure it's F for final. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Most of you have seen this, and if you have any questions, just let us know and we'll definitely work with you. It's pretty, list your amount for your activity hours, if you had any travel equipment, whatever you're claiming. And you also want to make sure you put your RFP number, request for payment. If you look at the top right, it says request for payment number. So if it's your first request, just put 1, second, 2, pretty easy. Compliance with bidding procedures is required per all applicable federal, state, and local guidelines. Again, that's part of this 2 CAFR Part 200, subpart F. And if applicable, the SC Consolidated Procurement Code and regulations. When you guys utilize your agency procurement guidelines, relevant documentation must be submitted to the OHSJP to support the purchases. And that's not limited to the approval procedures and specific procurement guidelines and laws. Below is a website to the South Carolina Procurement Code. Many of you guys use that. And you should be, I believe we're going to be sending out a copy of this. And if not, if you want a copy of this, please just reach out to us and we'll get it to you. So you have these links All approved grant-funded purchases must be requested, purchased, and received, invoiced, and paid on or before September 30th, 2023. During this time, you want to make sure you're only requesting, say you're requesting paper, you want to make sure you're only requesting enough for that grant period, okay? So we don't want to have any excess. So the amount you would be needing for that grant period only. All purchases must be submitted to us for review and approval prior to expending funds. This is very important. Please just shoot us an email, explain to us what you're doing before you make the purchase. Very important. Any subgrantee that fails to follow the outlined purchasing procedures could not receive reimbursement. So just communicate with us what you're doing so that we can get you all set up and make it a smooth sailing process when you go and ask for that reimbursement on your RFP. Moving on to state contracts. The OHSJP recommends procurement of approved and budgeted equipment items through state purchasing under a state contract if available and allowable per your agency guidelines. A listing of goods and services available for purchase under state contract is again at this link, and we'll, send that out to you guys so you can just click on it. Items purchased under state contracts must still be approved by us prior to purchase. So no matter what circumstance, if it's on state contract or not, please just shoot us an email. We're very available, very happy to help you in any way that we can. If we can make it work, we definitely will. So we're here for you guys. So, we aim to help you. That is our goal. I'm going to move on to general cost of government. Federal grant funds may not be used for activities considered general cost of governments. According to, the CAFR and our long-standing federal law codified in the government-wide rule for federal grants, unless specifically allowed under the federal statute or regulation, the rationale is that federal funds should not be used to support costs incurred by a state or locality in the ordinary course of conducting its own affairs. So day-to-day items is what they're talking about. But we'll also get more to that in just a moment. General cost of government includes salaries and other expenses associated with government operation. The super circular specifically identifies police and prosecutors who carry out government services normally provided to the general public. The replacement of routine and or existing state and local expenditures with the use of federal grant funds for costs or of activities that constitute general expenses required to carry out the overall responsibilities of state or local agency is considered to be replacement of general costs of government and is not allowed. So if you have, I know some of these things can be a little confusing on whether or not it's allowable or not. Again, just reach out to us. I am going to give you a list of some unallowable items so that can kind of clear that up for you. But we're here for you, and I'll say that over and over again. We just want to help you. So if you have even a question you may not even think is relevant, or you might even feel silly asking it, just ask it. We're here for you guys. An applicant's costs must be necessary, reasonable, and I apologize, I can't speak today. And be used in accordance with the terms and conditions specified in the grant. Highway safety grant funds are to be used to support state problem identification and planning and implementation of a program to address a wide range of highway safety problems that are related to human factors in the roadways. Programs should promote a reduction in traffic crashes, deaths, and injuries. So I told you before that there were a few changes this year. Beginning in federal fiscal year 2023, vehicles will not be purchased and requests for vehicles will not be considered. Vehicles previously purchased in FFY 2020 or before with 100% federal funds must only be used in support of grant activity hours with no breaks in mileage. For vehicles with a 10% buy-in, the travel support document should reflect mileage driven only in respect to project activity hours. And I do see some questions and comments that you guys are writing down, and I will get to those in a minute. I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you. I just can't see everything while I'm going through this. As in previous years, equipment-only grant applications will not be considered for funding. Grant projects are awarded on a year-to-year basis. All applicants must submit a grant application no later than the 11:59 p.m. deadline on February 25th, 2022 to be considered for FFY 2023 funds. So this is a pretty simple list that we have of unallowable costs. I feel like it covers a good bit of, questions you might have for us as far as the unallowable things. But again, if you have any questions, just reach out to us. So the unallowable costs, it covers vehicles, equipment installed in vehicles, weapons, weapon box, log storage, uniforms and badges, body-worn cameras, passive alcohol sensors, mainframe computers, stop sticks, land promotional items, license plate readers, electronic speed limit signs, golf carts, speed checkpoint trailers, permanent signage or signage without a safety message. This also includes the cost of construction, rehabilitation, or remodeling of state, local, or private buildings or structures, international travel, office furniture and fixtures, including but not limited to the following: desk, chairs, tables, filing cabinets, coat racks, bookcases, shelving, pictures, clocks, drapes, and portable partitions. This also includes monthly cell phone charges, radio service charges, Wi-Fi, MiFi service charges, block-in service trainings, and leave hours of any kind and hours spent working on a natural disaster. So we're going to get into project activity hours. Timesheets must be maintained for all project activity hours, reflecting the hours worked on and charged the grant. The total activity hours requested for reimbursement must match the total activity hours listed on your NEDR. Project activity must be 100% in support of activities agreed upon in the grant award. A good example of this is providing funeral escorts, parade duty, or hurricane natural disaster hours, and they're not considered part of project activities. You also want to make sure, again, the timesheets that you provide to us, please make sure they match up to what you're claiming. If you're claiming 8 hours on your timesheet, but you're telling us you want 10 hours to be reimbursed, we're not going to be able to do that. So moving on to the monthly activity time record, only list the hours actually worked that you can provide backup documentation to and provide, proof that you worked those hours. And you can only also list approved training hours that are applicable to grant activities as listed in the specific objectives. Hours recorded must be reflected on backup documentation. I know we sound a little repetitive, but we want to make sure everything matches. So when we're asked about it at the end of the year or whenever, we can say, hey, this is all matching up, on all of these sheets. This must be signed and certified by the project director. Please, if your project director has resigned or someone new has come in, just communicate with us so we can get that updated and to have matching signatures, because we do check that. There should be a corresponding form for each officer assigned. Training hours are only applicable under activity hour based grants. So this is just a preview of our monthly activity time record. The information at the top is pretty repetitive of your first page that I showed you previously. And you can see there's a column for activity hours worked and the approved training hours. Again, we use a matchup system in which we have where we match up what you're putting down on the sheet with your payroll, with all the backup documentation you provide. So please just make sure, everything lines up. And you do want to have the employee sign and the project director. So this one is a little bit different. If you have DUI alcohol grants or DUI drugs and there is going to be kind of a breakup. You want to list alcohol hours in one column and your other hours in the other. So make sure to break those down. So we ask you to do a little bit more on the sheet. So we are going to start on a little bit of explanation of these project hours. Activity hours for activity hour-based police traffic services enforcement and impaired driving countermeasures enforcement programs may be performed by more than one law enforcement officer. For example, you may assign up to 4 officers to perform a PTS or alcohol enforcement activities as long as the budgeted amount for personnel is not exceeded. Overtime activity hours for overtime-based PT services enforcement and impaired driving countermeasures enforcement programs may also be performed by more than one law enforcement officer without limitations as to the number of officers eligible to perform the overtime activity hours. For example, you may assign 20 officers to perform overtime PTS or alcohol enforcement activities as long as the awarded budget amount for personnel is not exceeded. So we're not really worried about how many officers you assign. It's just the amount that we can reimburse you. Activity hours, reimbursement for hours of eligible activity includes compensation for time spent on the activity and corresponding proportional share of fringe benefits. An example of those fringe benefits, excluding leave hours earned during the hours performed activity under the NHTSA funded activity hour-based grant. So you want to make sure your fringe benefits are proportion to the hours. So, you know, if you work, say, 40 extra hours on the grant and 80 extra hours overtime period, you want to make sure that your fringe benefits match up to that 40, not the total overtime that you would normally have. That doesn't include activity hours. Overtime hours, reimbursement for hours of eligible overtime activity includes compensation for time spent on the overtime activity and a corresponding proportional share of fringe benefits. Those fringe benefits, excluding leave hours earned during overtime hours only. The fringes must pertain directly to the overtime hours. An example, FICA, Medicare, retirement percentage, and workers' compensation, if applicable. A lot of you guys have probably all of that. And like I said, we just go based off the percentage of what you guys are actually working on the grant. Equipment will only be considered when there is a demonstrated need. Again, 2023 application requests for vehicles will not be considered. Supported equipment required to implement an enforcement program must be fully justified and must have a direct effect upon the apprehension and conviction of traffic DUI offenders. And the last bulletin, again, is just what I had said before. Vehicles previously purchased in federal fiscal year 2020 or before must only be used in support of grant activity hours with no breaks in mileage. For vehicles purchased between 2021 with 10% buy-in, the travel support document should reflect mileage driven only in respect to project activity hours or approved training. It should not exceed 10% for activities outside the grant. Again, a need for the requested equipment must be demonstrated in the problem identification. All grant-funded equipment must be used for the original authorized grant purposes for which it was acquired, whether or not the project continues to be supported by federal funds. Agencies receiving funds to purchase equipment must notify OHSJP to require disposition instructions when the equipment becomes obsolete and the agency desires to sell or dispose of the asset, or the equipment is no longer able to be used for its original purpose. So this is some allowable equipment that we normally see. We're looking at the handheld radar units, the LiDAR units, lighting and safety equipment. A good example is lighting used at checkpoints, traffic cones, reflective vests, rechargeable flashlights, checkpoint lighting supplies. Again, these devices must meet federal standards, and equipment-only grant applications will not be considered for funding in FFY 2023. I'll also emphasize, again, before you make these purchases, please send us an email asking for approval we generally get back to you guys pretty quick. We have to do some research ourselves, but you definitely need to be sending us an email before you make any of these purchases. So let's go over the Buy America Act. The Buy America Act 23 USC Super Circular 313 prohibits states from using highway grant funds under 23 USC Chapter 4 to purchase products unless they are produced, manufactured, or assembled in the U.S. This applies to steel, iron, and all manufactured products, unless the Secretary of Transportation has determined that it is appropriate to waive the Buy America Act requirement. All items with a unit cost greater than $5,000 must comply with Buy America and meet any bid requirements of the procurement process, if applicable. Items under $5,000 per unit are not required to comply with Buy America. This is an example of your certificate. I did just see a question regarding vehicles in the Buy America. Again, I'll let Angela kind of dive more into that question. And we'll get back to you. But this is an example of the Buy America certificate. If you have problems getting contacts, to get this filled out, we can help you. Again, we're here for you guys. So any purchases over $5,000 will need this though. And yes, that is correct. No vehicles are to be purchased in 2023. Travel and training, travel support documents should reflect mileage driven only in respect to project activity, overtime hours, or approved training. This is also some documentation we compare to your monthly activity time record. So if we see on, say, 10/1/2022 that you have claimed miles, but we see on your monthly activity time record that there's no time listed where you were working on the project, we're not going to be able to reimburse that because you're telling us that on that day that you're claiming that mileage, you did not work project activity hours, and we cannot reimburse for that. The Office of Highway Safety and Justice Programs must approve all requests for out-of-state travel in writing in advance and must be specifically listed in the travel section of the approved application budget. The mileage rate should match what is listed on the grant in your agency policy. Every year, we'll probably send you out an email telling you the IRS rate for the new year. And if your agency rate is less than the IRS rate, you must use your agency rate. There must be a corresponding entry for a particular day and this is going back to exactly what I said. On your monthly activity record, it's got to show that you were working project hours on the day you're claiming mileage, okay? So there must be a corresponding entry for a particular day on the activity timesheets that matches an entry on the mileage document for that same day in order for the subgrantee to receive reimbursement for mileage. Again, this must be signed by the project director before mileage reimbursement can take place. It's a wee bit cut off, just a little bit, but you can definitely see everything that we're asking for. Again, you see the dates, your origin, your destination, purpose of the trip, your beginning mileage and ending mileage, and below you can do some calculations to show us how many miles for that month you're claiming and the rate per mile. So if your agency's 0.565, you multiply that by the total miles, that'll give you your amount. So again, that was just an example, but it depends on your agency and the IRS for the year. They do change basically yearly. I believe it comes out like the very 1st of January. And we will, again, try to get that information out to you guys. Travel and training costs are allowable to pay for the salary of grant-funded personnel while pursuing OHSJP approved training travel when prior approval is obtained and trainings are specifically listed in the budget narrative. Training hours are only applicable under activity hour-based grants. Failure to obtain such prior written approval will result in such travel expense claims being denied for reimbursement using grant funds. Attendees will only be reimbursed up to the maximum allowable rate for lodging established by the GSA, excluding taxes and surcharges. Documentation is required for all travel expenses. This may include agendas, hotel receipts, parking receipts, and taxi receipts. Just a reminder, we don't pay tips. The current policy of the Comptroller General Office is only allows reimbursement after the lodging expenses have occurred. Therefore, billing payments made upfront through travel websites such as Expedia, Kayak, Travelocity, etc., are considered advance payments and will not be reimbursed by OHSJP. If the approved attendee is unable to travel or attend a training for any reason, we cannot reimburse for those expenditures. The sub-grantee is encouraged to request a refund from the original vendor to be reimbursed for any unused travel expenses. This is an overview of the South Carolina meal per diem. This is also available on the CG's website. The maximum is in-state is $35, out of state is $50. You can see the breakdown for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And also, please make sure to pay attention to those depart and return times in order to correctly ask for reimbursement for each meal. Indirect cost rates. States and local government and Indian tribes, each agency receiving grants to which indirect costs may be charged must have an approved indirect cost rate. Agencies must prepare an indirect cost proposal and submit it to State Indirect Cost Officer for review and approval. The Office of Highway Safety and Justice Programs reserves the right to negotiate indirect cost rate charges to a grant prior to award. If the agency does not have a negotiated rate, they can elect to charge the de minimis indirect cost rate of 10% of the modified total direct cost. Private nonprofit organizations receiving federal funds are authorized to recover indirect costs. The programmatic and financial monitoring visit will be conducted at least once during the grant period. The OHSJP monitoring team will conduct the visit. The project director will receive advance notification for the visit. Additionally, a checklist will be forwarded to the project director that describes in detail the items that will need to be available for the visit. Generally, our team member will send you out an email giving you a long list of what times you might be available to work with us on that. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and list them out in our comment box so that we can get to those. And I will let Angela answer those questions for you guys. I don't know if she'll speak or just comment through the chat box, but you should receive an answer for those shortly.
I'm going to go ahead and, this is Angela Campbell, Grants Accounting Manager. I will go ahead and answer the two questions that we had in the chat box during the presentation. The first one was, is there a grant award cap? We do not set a cap for your grant applications. You're able to request as little or as much as you'd like. However, just be aware that we may adjust those amounts during our review and approval process if the award is approved. Another question that we had was about vehicles. We are not allowing the purchase of vehicles in federal fiscal year 2023. The Buy America Act guidance is just there for any other equipment that would exceed that $5,000 amount. We don't anticipate that you will run into any equipment that is over $5,000, but that is there just in case that you do come across anything that's over $5,000 per unit in that allowable list. Are there any other questions on the financial side or the programmatic side? At this point, we're taking any questions that you have. All right, I'm not seeing anything else. If you do want to reach out to us separately, you are more than welcome to do that. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. And we will also make any questions that come to us separately, we'll make those available for everyone as well. And again, we'll make this PowerPoint available for everyone that has participated today.
Angela, it looks like we have a new question.
Oh, okay, I see it now. I just scroll down. Let's see here. What is the reason that equipment cannot be purchased in 2023? So in 2023, that's where we're starting our shift over to overtime grants. And for overtime grants, we are not allowing equipment because the equipment has to be solely for use during grant activity hours only. And since overtime hours, you know, would not be the sole purpose of the use of that equipment, that is why we could not allow for equipment, and we're moving towards to only providing overtime grants in the future. Let's see. If we already have a traffic team, are we supplanting if we request reimbursement for traffic enforcement activities? I believe in the programmatic section, it's supposed to be in addition to the activities that you're already completing. That way it's not considered general cost of government. Any other questions? The question that we had was regarding supplanting. So with the NHTSA guidance that came across with general cost of government, it is not considered general cost of government because you're supplementing your traffic team with these additional activity hours. So overtime will only be an option in the future for everyone. For enforcement grants, that is something that we are, you know, we're doing this pilot program right now, but that is what we envision for the projects in the future. We're still working on planning everything for years beyond 2023, but this is really our pilot project year for the overtime grants, but we'll have more information for you about that in the future. Would prosecutors only be able to count court time as working on said project? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. So court time would be an allowable prosecutor project activity, but there are other prosecutors that are other prosecutor activities that would be considered as project activity in addition to just court time. But yes, it would have to be activities that are related to that DUI and alcohol caseload.
Angela, this is Jasmine. Just to jump in for that question,
Yeah, sure.
I think that was from Aaron McGuire.
Yep.
Aaron, if you go on our website, we have a link to the, I think I mentioned earlier, like supporting documentation. So we have some of our forms for the Special DUI Prosecutor Grant, and there's a tracker, like an activity tracker, and you'll be able to see some of the activities that we've outlined as eligible activities for the Special DUI Prosecutor Grants. To give you just a general overview of our eligible activities for those grants.
All right, any other questions? If equipment pertains to safety by DHEC, can this be pursued? It would depend on what it is. You can certainly request it in your grant application, and we will review it in that grant application. And we'll put together a list of these questions to send out so that you have something in writing for all of these as well. That way you can reference back to it if you need to. And let's see, do we need to know how many activity hours we want repayment for prior to the grant being given? So this year, our plan is to do it a little bit differently. You would request the amount either in terms of activity hours or just in terms of the overall amount of funding that you think you would need for those activity hours. We had everyone list out a range of specific activity hours in previous years, but for this upcoming 2023 year, it would be okay if you just simply requested the amount of funding that you would need for those specific activity hours, whether they be grant-based activity hours or grant-related overtime hours. So the one thing you just want to make sure you differentiate in the personnel section of the grant application is that whether or not you're requesting just regular activity-based hours or overtime hours. So it would be helpful to have an idea of how many activity hours you would be needing so that you can appropriately request the correct amount of funding. All right, any other questions? These are all really great questions so far, so don't be shy if you have something else. What is the cap for overtime activity hours? There actually is not a cap. Similar to the amount of funding, we are not putting a cap on the amount of overtime hours that you can request. It's a little bit more, it's a little simpler to request overtime activity hours because there aren't as many fringes involved. So we did not put a cap on the number of officers that you could request or the number of overtime activity hours. You just have to be able to show that they actually are in fact overtime hours. You want to make sure you're following your own agency policy where that's concerned. All right, anything else for today? I don't see anything else coming in. If anyone does have any additional questions, please do reach out to us individually. We'll put something together to answer all of those questions that we get so that everyone has reference to it. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I think there may be a few additional slides here regarding specific objectives and things like that. So I'll turn it over at this point. If you have any additional questions at the end, you can continue asking those in the chat box and we'll address those at the end. So now we're just going on to, you decided to apply, now what?
Thank you guys so much for staying with us, and I am going to turn it over now.
All right, so thank you to Holly and Angela for delivering that financial portion and also answering your questions. Again, please continue, like Angela said, put those questions in the chat. I'm also going to use this time to remind you if you have not signed in. So if you'll type in your name and agency in the chat box, so that way we can have another list of attendees. Please sign in into the chat box for us. All right, so we've now hit the last section of our workshop today. So these are tips on how to write a successful grant application. All right, so you've decided that you're going to apply. Now what? So what makes a successful application? So you'd want to use the why, what, where, who, how, and when strategy. Why are you applying? What is the problem? Where is the problem occurring? Who will solve and or address it? How will it be solved? And when will it be solved? So for the why are you applying? Because there's a problem, right? You've identified that there's a problem in your jurisdiction, in your area, or that there's a need. So the problem statement of your application should include data, statistical data, and should provide answers to the following questions. What is the problem and where is the problem occurring? So for the problem statement, if you need to submit a statistical data request to our office, please do so. If you have current data for your jurisdiction, you would use that as well. Goals and objectives. So program goals or goals will broadly answer the question of what will be achieved, and objectives or specific objectives will detail the steps taken on the road to achieving those written goals. So a program goal or goals is a broad statement of what the project hopes to accomplish. So it's the final impact or outcome of the proposed project. Program goals should be general, intangible, and abstract, and should also be linked to your problem statement. All right, on this slide, we have an example of an appropriate program goal. So for example, program goal that you would include in your grant application could be to decrease the number of DUI-related collisions in the city of Smith by 10% from 38 in 2021 to 34 by September 30th, 2023, which is the end of the grant period. All right, so for specific objectives. So specific objectives is a step or steps toward accomplishing the program goals or goals. A specific objective should be narrow, precise, tangible, concrete, and measurable. It should also include a time point by which the objective should be met. So the purpose of these specific objectives is to establish benchmarks for your grant project and also to help us facilitate monitoring and evaluation of your grant project. Just to note, we've done this in previous years and we're going to continue to do this in FFY 2023. So the highway safety grant projects will have uniform objectives that will support the FFY 2023 South Carolina Highway Safety Plan that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So depending on the type of project you'll have, like all PTS projects, all occupant protection, all alcohol impaired driving, all special DUI prosecutor, those projects are going to have uniform objectives. Those specific objectives will enhance our collective ability to duplicate the best countermeasure strategies for improving traffic safety in the state. As I mentioned earlier, there are sample grants online that have the uniform objectives. So you can look at those for those activity hours or straight time grants. And then we will notify you when we update the website with the overtime sample grants. All right, so for those specific objectives, we ask that they're SMART. And so in crafting those uniform objectives, we've made sure that they're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So this example is actually taken, it's actually a uniform objective. So it's to conduct a minimum of 12 traffic safety presentations on topics including but not limited to the dangers of speeding, the dangers of distracted driving, the dangers of driving while impaired, etc. By September 30th, 2023. So this uniform objective meets the SMART tool. It's specific, it's measurable, it's attainable, it's relevant, and it's time-based. All right, so the Highway Safety Review Checklist. So this checklist is also included on pages 31 and 32 of the Highway Safety Funding Guidelines that's available on our website. So as you are drafting your application, you want to go through this checklist to make sure that your problem statement is clear and concise, that you've provided sufficient information regarding the problem provided, you've provided sufficient data in your problem analysis to prove that the problem exists in your jurisdiction, and that you also have adequate information on the current situation in your problem analysis. Continuing with that checklist, for your narrative, does your narrative describe the project and discuss the tasks and activities proposed to correct your identified problem? The performance indicators, so the performance indicators are tied to your specific objectives. So will the performance indicators listed measure the attainment of stated objectives? Has the data source to measure effect been identified? Will the indicators listed measure the impact of your program goals? Have you included an evaluation plan in your application? Also, have you included a continuation plan of project activity in your application? So if funding was received in the previous fiscal year, has a thorough analysis of the results of the previous year's project been included in the narrative? So if you've had a grant last year and you've seen success with that grant project, you want to include that information in your narrative. Very important, does the application fall under one of the program areas identified for funding? So you want to make sure all of the program areas, the three that we discussed today, that your application falls under to one of those program areas, so that way it's eligible for funding. So have all costs been satisfactorily justified according to the approach proposed? And has sufficient budget detail been given in all of your figures that you've entered? Have you checked those for accuracy? So again, this checklist, we're going to be sending you the presentation, hopefully by close of business today. But again, this checklist is listed on pages 31 and 32 of the Highway Safety Funding Guidelines document for FFY 2023. That's available on our website. All right, once again, two big deadlines. So SCDPS Grants is our online grants management website. If you do not already have an account on SCDPS Grants, the deadline to create that account is February 11th by 5 p.m. And the biggest deadline is that all applications must be submitted via SCDPS Grants by 11:59 p.m. on Friday, February 25th, 2022. That is a hard deadline. No applications will be accepted past the deadline. So you want to ensure, just some tips, like I said earlier, you've already met the deadline to create your new user account. You've saved a backup copy. I always tell folks to pull up the website and also pull up a Word document and copy your application to that Word document, so that way you have something should something happen. On the SCDPS Grants, you want to save often, so that way you don't lose any data. Another tip, please review the funding guidelines document. I so thank you all for participating in the workshop. You know, we tried to get as much information in the presentation. However, that funding guidelines document will really help you and assist you in drafting and completing your application. Also, please don't hesitate to contact myself. I'm Jasmine Simmons. I'm the Planning and Evaluation Coordinator, or we have a Police Traffic Services and Occupant Protection Program Coordinator and an Impaired Driving Countermeasures Program Coordinator. Please contact one of us for technical assistance. if you need help in completing your application. Also, if you have any financial questions on our website, we have Holly's information, as well as Salima Richburg. She's our other grants administration accountant. And again, if you need any of that, if you have a statistical data request, Ross and his team's contact information is also available on our website. So I'm seeing, okay, let's see. I see some questions that have come up in the chat. Okay, I think the last question is, who do I talk to about getting a new login information from an old registration under an old administration? So you need a new, so what I'm understanding is you need a new account. You should be able to, if I'm understanding correctly, you may have a new email now because you're working for a different agency. You should be able to create a new account on SCDPS grants. If you're registering under a different email, if it's the same email, please shoot me an email so I can give you the technical support number for our SCDPS grants website. But I believe you should be able to just create a new account. All right, any other questions?
Jasmine, there was a question earlier that someone asked if a person is working 100% toward grant goals and objectives and something additional comes up, can they also qualify for overtime hours? The answer to that is no, but there is a caveat to that. The grant activity hours and the overtime grants are completely separate. So we're not able to mix and match the hours within one grant, but you are able to have a police traffic services, for example, regular activity hours grant, as well as an overtime grant under that same umbrella. However, the same officer cannot simultaneously be working on both grants at the same time. Just for tracking purposes, we want to keep everything completely separate on the overtime versus the activity hours grants.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for getting that question. I think that's probably the last question. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude the workshop. Thank you all for joining us today, for sitting there for 2 hours and learning about our Highway Safety Grant Program. Please make sure to utilize all the resources available to you to complete your application, especially I know there's some folks on here who this is their first time attending a highway safety, an OHSJP workshop for the highway safety side. So please utilize all those resources available to you. We want to make sure that you have a successful grant application. And just finally, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.